Gambit see your bet and raise it. But the cards always be in my favor.
Mutant intruder neutralized.
The name's Gambit, mon ami. Remember it.
During a joyous and festive night on the island of Genosha, a sentinel attack puts Gambit in motion to protect his people and the woman he loves with the moment that changed the course of this season in XMen 97. Speaking of nostalgia, Bryan.
I know, right?
XMen 97, we're
Yeah.
returning to that glorious animated era. Did you partake in that when you were younger?
I'm ashamed to say that I didn't.
That's okay. Don't be ashamed.
I've watched. This was that era. I was like deep in the Power Rangers.
You had picked your team.
I did. I had picked my color coded team.
Yeah.
But no, I'm very familiar with the show, and I did watch episodes, but I wasn't like a diehard repeat.
But you were familiar with the characters because of
yeah.
the movies. You knew who Wolverine was,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You understood like Bub was a thing that he said.
Yeah.
It's fascinating watching X-Men 97 and seeing how, for me, it does justice to the memory of what the X-Men animated series was.
Oh.
Because I have gone back and rewatched that show.
Okay.
And like the Phantom Menace, I had some problems with it when I was a kid because I was
Really?
such a comic book nut, right?
Oh, that's right, that's
Chris
right.
Claremont's
That's
comics with Jim Lee and Mark Silvestri and Wallace Patricio, like those, that was my jam. You got to do justice by that. And I never felt like the show really did it.
Okay.
This does, and also the animation has evolved, and I feel like they're doing a great job of capturing the feel of what the classic animation was, yet still bringing a lot of anime influence to it and contemporary design.
Yeah.
I think it looks phenomenal.
Yeah, the show looks, and I guess we can start there with just the look of it and the animation of it, because you're right. I think when the trailer first came out, a lot of people were like, oh, okay, they are really paying homage to the 90s era, that style of animation, but really updating it for the modern era.
There's like that rogue kick that stretched across the entirety of the frame, right? Where she's elongated. Like that is style, right? Like that's doing something different.
Yeah. No, and I love seeing all that, and all the action sequences with all the anime influences is extremely apparent with a lot of the influences that it's pulling from 97.
And a tremendous amount of love for the characters, right?
Yeah.
And like you see it in that clip that we just showed, like the fact that we went there with Gambit.
Dude, I mean, you're right. Episode 5 was a turning point for this show. And I did not see that coming, and I did not think that they would go there. And I'm glad that they did, because the second half of this season, from what we see, what happens with the destruction of Genosha and the killing of Gambit, it takes these characters in some interesting directions.
It takes these characters to prestige TV suddenly. Like the first half of this season, you're like, okay, this is cool. I like this update of the animated series. Right? Like, what they're doing with Gene and Madeline Pryor in that third episode is extremely complicated and weird and very comics. It's uncomfortable. All right, it's super uncomfortable, and also we're not going to erase it. We're going to let you sit and how uncomfortable that is. But it's still basically just doing like the old show, but a little updated.
Yeah, it feels like that's the nostalgia, is bringing people back with those first 4 episodes.
Yeah, and then with Gambit and Remember It, now we're moving forward and we're going into a style of television filmmaking that the original show just did not have.
So, because I want to get deep into the back half of this episode, of this season, but I do want to touch on, I believe it was episode 2, when they have the UN summit. When Storm loses her powers.
Right.
Because, it feels like the first half of this season is really kind of like building on nostalgia, but it also is dealing with some really heavy stuff.
But taking all the plot points from the comics. Like that stuff is in the comics. It's all done a little bit differently. There's some shifts there, especially the Madeline and Jean stuff. But like Storm and Forge, that's the life-death storyline. Their relationship, I think, is beautifully captured in the few episodes that we got with them in this season. Like like the comics were melodrama. These were soap operas with capes, right? And this is still doing that.
Yeah. It feels like a soap opera. So those first 3 episodes, especially when we get to the reveal of Madeline Pryor and when Cable, her son is born, Nathan.
There's all these relationship dynamics happening. There's the ones that are at like the forefront, like the romance between Scott and Jean, and now Madeline, the clone over here. But then you also have, there's something going on with Storm and Forge that's interesting. Obviously, Rogue and Gambit is the tragic relationship of this season. And if you're a Rogue and Gambit fan, I bet you this season was real rough for you.
Yes.
There's the Magneto of it all with Rogue. But then you also have something going on, and you really catch it on the rewatch, something going on between Morph and Logan, Wolverine.
Oh, yeah.
The last scene between Morph and Logan in the final episode, I was crying.
It's extremely touching. There's a lot of great character dynamics. I mean, even with Jubilee and Sunspot.
Yes,
there's a lot of interesting things going on there. But then we get to episode 5, and let's talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk more about it as we get into the next segment as well. But then after Gambit dies, we see the shift in a lot of these characters, and we see the shift in Rogue.
And I kept waiting for the rewind. Like, how are we going to undo that?
Undo it.
Right? Like,
undo.
I was impressed with the death that we see there.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, by the next episode, we're going to work our way to bringing Gambit back.
Comics.
Right? Yeah. And I think maybe based on the final moments of this season, we're getting to that rewind. It's possible. There's a way that they can do it quite easily. The comics give them a way out. But the fact that they let us sit with that tragedy for the entire season, unexpected and satisfying.
Yeah, and I love where it takes the character of Rogue, because at that point, she becomes like my favorite character in this whole season, as far as like what she's dealing with the grief of losing Gambit, and she kind of goes like on this vengeful like quest. And then, we get cameos from, when she runs into Captain America.
Her taking the shield from Cap is one of the coolest things I've seen in the MCU.
I loved it. I loved it. It's so petty, but it was great.
I love this interpretation of Steve Rogers. How the X-Men see Steve Rogers is a delight for me.
Yeah, because it really does feel like it's kind of creating that divide of where the X-Men stand.
That flag you're wearing on your chest, they're building robots, man. Robots to come kill me and my family. And you're Captain America?
Yeah. We got a couple more minutes in this segment, but we'll talk more about this. But Bastion. The villain.
Yeah, the most boring supervillain in all of comics.
But then we also get Mr. Sinister. So it feels like it's starting with Mr. Sinister, but then we realize that there's another big bad and Bastion. But you say he's the most boring and
terrible in the comics. I hate him. No one likes him. His story is so convoluted; it makes no sense. And yet here we are in this show, and you're like, I like this guy.
Oh, okay. So it works. So it doesn't work in the comics,
Bastion.
But it works. It definitely works here.
You told 13-year-old Brad that they're going to do justice by this character in 2024. It's like, you're crazy.
You're crazy. It's not going to happen. But they do it. And I think they do it, especially with the motivation, especially like getting his backstory, where he came from, the relationship that he has with his mother, what his ultimate plan is as far as reproducing the Sentinels.
A few exceptions in this series, there is no real villain. Right, everyone's got a motivation, and even the hateful, racist scum soldiers, the Proud Boy stand-ins of this,
the Friends of Humanity,
the Mutant Liberation Front, not Mutant Liberation Front. I'm getting that wrong. Don't worry. But those guys, they're telling their story in a very real-world way. You get them. You're terrified by them, but they feel like people you see on the news. That bit, the death of Gambit, and how he uses his powers to charge the Sentinel and turn the Sentinel into a weapon. Yeah. There's a lot of fun, repurposing of powers in this show, especially with Gambit. We see that moment in the first episode where he charges up Wolverine's claws. And, then Morph turns into the Blob as a trampoline and propels Logan onto the Sentinel and explodes. I love how clever they're really thinking about what would we do with this set of superpowers.
Of superpowers, and going to Morph real quick. I mean, he felt like he was kind of like the Easter egg of the show. With like who he was able to morph into, and all the different characters that we got to see through his morphing powers.
Because he's not just morphing into a physical shape, right? Like when he becomes the Blob, he has the Blob's ability. When he becomes Psylocke, he has Psylocke's ability.
Exactly.
Like that's a pretty powerful mutant. I think we need to respect Morph a little bit more.
Dude, I'm like Quicksilver, the Hulk. I mean, he turns into a lot of, and like you say, he retains their power. So he's pretty powerful. Going to the aftermath of Genosha, we talked a lot about, the humans and the mutants. And there's a couple of different scenes that really stood out to me where you can see that the mutants were looking for help from, all the other United Nations to try to rebuild Genosha. And, Cyclops is talking to the president, and he's like, the president's like, well, we can't, expend this much resources to help. And, it's just like how things, the optics of how things look. And I love that Cyclops hangs up on the president. And then, the relationship that Beast has with the reporter Trish, I believe it is. And there starts to be a divide when the mutants see that, okay, maybe the humans don't really have our back in the way that we thought that they did. And I always thought that was an interesting conversation to have because it reminded me of something that Magneto said in episode 2 when he took the United Nations leaders up into space and he was like, don't let me let you down. But it also, the inverse of that feels like the humans are constantly letting the mutants down.
Right, absolutely. Like this show takes you to a point where it says Magneto is right, right? We get it in the present tense, and you have to sit with that for a little bit, and you go, yeah, Magneto is right. And then it brings Charles Xavier back. He's been hanging out in space, getting married to Lalandra, and now you're like, well, what do you do with Charles? And how are we supposed to feel about you? Like he's a kind of like I want to eat my cake and have it too kind of guy. And being that, he lets everyone down.
It's Professor X, especially when he comes back to Earth, is such a frustrating character because but I love the dichotomy between Magneto and Professor X because they have two opposing ideologies of how they approach the mutant-human relationships or relations. And especially like when Charles Xavier comes back, he doesn't know what he doesn't know what they've been through with Genosha. But yet he still has this idea of what his dream was.
This is how it should be.
This is how it should be. But it's like, you haven't been here to experience the devastation that we've been going through.
We've been pursuing your dream, and it's not working, right? Magneto is offering a different option, and it seems a lot more practical.
And then there becomes a divide within the X-Men. When Magneto comes back and he's just like, who's going to come with me? And we see Rogue. Sunspot, I kind of got why he went with Magneto, but you start to see this divide. But then it comes together so beautifully in like those last couple of episodes. But yeah, I want to also talk about the soap opera. And then I also want to talk about that family dynamic between Cyclops and Jean Grey and Cable and some of those final moments that we got between them. I thought it was beautiful the way they were able to have that so-called goodbye with Cable and the character of Cable, his relationship with his parents.
What you don't know based on just this season of television is that Scott was abandoned by his father, right? And he and his brother Havoc grew up alone. And, that created a lot of strife and anguish, and the idea then when Nathan is infected by this techno-organic virus by Mr. Sinister, and the only cure is to give him to Bishop so that the child is raised in the future.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't want to abandon, he won't be a part of abandoning his son. And in not being a part of abandoning his son, he abandons his son, right?
Yeah.
But then we get some reconciliation with the son all grown up now as Cable. Man, I love comics. This is why I love comics. And then what happens in the final moments of this series is Cyclops and Jean are propelled to the future where they can raise their child.
So let's get to that before we get to the end of the show. Where we leave the characters, because now they're splintered. We have some characters in the past.
3,000 years ago.
Some characters in the future.
Yeah.
We see Apocalypse.
Yeah, the young version.
Young version, and in the present day, because we're possibly getting Gambit back as one of the four horsemen. Where do you see how this ends and where we could go?
Well, this is the Age of Apocalypse storyline, right? So the future that they're in is ruled over by Apocalypse. And so we're going to see the beginning of Apocalypse's journey, this first mutant in Egypt 3,000 years ago. And we're going to see where his story is going to end. And can we stop that future from occurring? And should we stop that future from occurring? And in the process, raise my son.
Yeah. Because they never got the chance to raise their son. Man, it's setting up all the character dynamics and all the drama.
And who that woman is, I'm not going to spoil it, under the hood, who comes out in the future and greets them. Her relationship to Scott and Jean is interesting too.
Dude, I cannot wait for season 2. Okay, all right. So, all right. We're going to get out of this segment. What's your rating for this?
This is some of the most fun I've had watching TV all year.
Yeah.
Of course, I loved it. It's a B+ for sure.
Easily a B+. It's one of the best series I've seen this year. Well, by the end of this year, when I do a top 10 of shows, it's definitely going to be in that. Yeah, easily.
If you liked what you just saw,
then check us out on YouTube at PGC TV Online, and we'll see you at the movies.